man became a monk. He entered a monastery. He took the vow of silence, and he could speak on a specific day only, just once a year. And he had to talk before the head monk. And he could only say 2 words. So after the first year, he stood before his superior, who signaled him to speak after this year of silence, and he said, "Bed hard." And then he went back to work as a monk. And the next year came around, and again he was summoned by the head monk to break his vow of silence. And he had 2 words again, and he said, "Food bad." And then he returned to his work, year 3. He came to the head monk at the end of year 3, and he had 2 words, and he said, "I quit." To which the head monk said, "I am not surprised. You've done nothing but complain since you've been here." I don't know about you, but for me, complaining is hard to break. In fact, some of us, it seems to me, treat it like it's our spiritual gift, as if it takes a certain giftedness to spot and point out problems that nobody else could see, but I have the gift of being able to see it. And in this world, we're surrounded by complainers, aren't we? I mean, some of you, truthfully, may sleep with one. Others have one in the back seat of the minivan. Some of you have friends with a Facebook group that could be labeled Friends Who Grumble. Try being a preacher for a while. You get to hear a lot of stuff. It's so easy to see it in others, and it's so hard to see it in ourselves. And I'll tell you, after wrestling with this passage this past week, I confess it is one of my biggest sins. And please don't ask Becky for confirmation on that, okay? Let's just not go there. I was thinking about the different types of complainers. Might have shared some of this with you before, but go ahead and put the next slide up there, Jeff. I know they're the whiners. These are the people that wake up negative. You know what I mean? I mean, a woman went to work one day in a foul mood, and her coworker asked her, "Did you wake up grumpy this morning?" And she answered, "No, I let him sleep in." Their catchphrase is, "It's just not fair. It's just not fair. Everyone else gets to do it. They get all the breaks. If it was fair," as someone said, "people would get to fly over pigeons." You have to think about that one, huh? All right. How about this? The cynics. Wow. Favorite phrase is, "Nothing ever changes." How about the book of Ecclesiastes? Sort of the ultimate cynic without God. Meaningless, a chasing after the wind. My thought is, it's easy to criticize from the distant height of the hillside when the battle is being fought in the valley. But some of us kind of like that view, a little higher than everybody else, and being able to look out and pass our judgment on others. How about the martyrs? Their favorite phrase is, "No one appreciates me." With all the work that I have done, after all that I've done for this church, all that I've done for him or her, they give, and appreciation is not or does not feel consistent with the service. And you know what? It never is. And believe me, as a minister, again, I sometimes feel that. And then I say, good gracious, who am I working for? Who am I serving? Then the perfectionist. Favorite phrase, is that the best you can do? Really, don't we have a little bit higher standards? Nothing is ever quite right for them, nothing ever good enough because their standards are up here, and so their complaints have a tendency to wear you down. Did everybody find themselves just a bit in one of those? It's a little bit difficult, isn't it? Here in the heart of this section, in Philippians chapter 2, in verse 14, go ahead and put that verse up there, Jeff, if you don't mind. The text says this simply, and we're going to build around it for just a moment. But right there in the center, it says this: do everything without grumbling or arguing. Some translations say complaining. Paul reminds the Philippians to resist what I am calling this morning the spirit of complaint. So you see, I believe there's place and a time for complaining, that is to register complaints. You can look at the Psalms, particularly in the Old Testament, and many of them are complaints to God. But I think that what Paul is addressing here in this passage is something that I find more insidious, and if I could even use a stronger word, cancerous. That is a spirit of complaint that can sometimes set in our heart or in our soul, where we allow the devil himself to reside. And this goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, where we see this spirit of complaint showing itself. And then it runs from there, and you can trace it through the Old Testament, and then finally through the heart of every person and every believer. And I remember my son Dan, one of the earliest verses that he learned when we lived up in Connecticut was this verse from Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14. Do all things without complaining or grumbling. Our text says this in Philippians 2:12, backing up just a minute. It says, therefore, my dear brothers, as you have always obeyed, and now, not only in my presence, but now how much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. God commands us to work it out with this fear and trembling. It sounds a little frightening at first, at least. There's this intriguing challenge, because I thought salvation was a free gift from God, that there was nothing we could do to earn it, that He has given it to us through the cross of Christ. So if it's not about earning our salvation, what does He mean to work out your salvation with fear and trembling? Paul, better than anyone, knows that we were saved by grace through faith, and not because what we have done, but because of what He, meaning Christ, has done. He makes this abundantly clear in the book of Romans and the book of Galatians. So what does he mean? I think he's trying to say, in our small group this past week, got to talk about this, and great insight came out of that, in fact, by one of our group members, that working out is the working out on the outside of what God is doing on the inside. And I want you to see verse 13. Go ahead and put up 13, and I'll finish my thought. God, we're working out our salvation in the world, and it's really we're working out what God has already given us. We're working out salvation in our relationships. We're working out salvation in the way that we view the world. We're working out our salvation in the way we see other people and learning to love them the way Christ loved them. We're working out our salvation in the way we conduct ourselves. We're working out our salvation because we want the kingdom, the rule, the reign of God to come on earth as it is in heaven. What God has given us, now we're implementing it into the world around us. I don't know if that's what that passage means, but I love that interpretation of it. And then it says, on the inside, for it is God who works in you. While we're working it on the outside, He's working in us to will and to act in order to fulfill His good purposes. John Calhoun, what He has started in you, He promises to finish. Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, we saw that earlier. He's working it in you. We're working out our salvation. He's working out His grace and His holiness within us. And then He says in verse 15, He says this, so that you may become blameless and pure. This is His desire for His children. God's desire for His children, worded through the Apostle Paul, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. That is so challenging, I'm not sure who even wants to sign up for it. But this is what we are called to, and I highlighted it in yellow for the simple reason that this is a direct quote from the Old Testament. And what Paul is thinking about as he views those Philippians and they're as children of God, he is reminded of the children of Israel. And in fact, he's reminded after the Exodus. And they had been set free and they had been given their salvation and they had been liberated and they had been chosen as these people, as these children. But once they found themselves out in the desert, all sorts of bad things, they forgot their way, right? And they begin to grumble and complain. And so the word here, we have this idea of a crooked, without fault, in a warped and crooked generation, a perverse generation. The word really is the one, scoliosis or twisted, or there's a curvature of the spine. And we can come up with a laundry list of perversions in this crooked and depraved culture. But Paul's point is that all of these perversions are related to one thing: complaining. And so he references Deuteronomy 32 in verse 5. Moses and the children of Israel is describing how God became angry with those Israelites after the Exodus, and the one sin that they repeated again and again and again, which did in fact turn God to anger, was grumbling and complaining. Now, would it have been easy in the wilderness? I don't think so. Would it have been comfortable? Hardly. Would not have been obvious as to what was next and where the leadership was taking these people. There would have been all kinds of reasons in that journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai to be whiners and martyrs and cynics and perfectionists. But what I want you to see is this week, if you could catch yourself when you start to complain, is that you're complaining against God. When the people complained against Moses and Aaron, Moses said, God has heard your complaining against him. And we know the rest of the story. That is the 2-week journey from the Red Sea into the land of Canaan amounted to 40 years of wandering. Now, do you have a gym teacher at one point in your life that told the class when you complained or grumbled that you could go ahead and just take a lap? Or maybe if you whined about picking up the dodgeballs, they said, why don't you just take a lap, Kryder? And if you complained about taking a lap, they would say, why don't you take another lap? Well, the Israelites complained, and God said, why don't you take another lap in the desert? And their complaining ultimately resulted in their own death, and a whole generation dies in the desert. The spirit of complaint was so strong that God told them to take another lap and learn to trust. Learn to trust me. Because all of this complaining, biblically speaking, is related to one issue. And it's simply this. I can put it in one word. Unbelief. A whole bunch of us today say we're believers. But when we find ourselves with a spirit of complaint, maybe we are a whole lot more like an unbeliever than a believer. The root of complaining is at the heart of unbelief, and I can show you that. We don't have time this morning. Psalm 78, 21, and 22. God is angry because of their unbelief, which leads to disobedience. You can see it again in Hebrews chapter 3, 15 through 19. But here's what happens. The door shuts on those who disobey, who refuse to believe, and they will not enter God's rest. I want you to see one more piece of the passage here. If complaining is not our spiritual gift, then what are we called to? And go ahead to the next slide to 15b, Jeff, if you don't mind. There it is. So that you will become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. This is God's desire. For those who will believe, who will live in trust, and to allow their life to correspond with that, as opposed to the spirit of complaint. If you wander in the dark, the North Star does what? It shines. It does not mock. It is not a cynic. It does not complain. It quietly, consistently points the way to go. The light we hold is the gospel, the word of life, the fact that we can walk each day knowing God's got this. God's got this. I'm not going to give way to grumbling or complaining or to fear. God's got this. We are His children. Christ is in us. Forgiveness is now, and there is hope to come. So here's the two compelling images, and I'll finish this with an illustration this morning. Seems to be there's two contrasts that are being made in the passage. One is this: grumbling desert wanderers. And the other is a star shining in the universe. I was reading a blog this week by a fellow named Stephen Lee, and he said this. He says, I know you've forgiven all my sins on the cross, and you've rescued me from eternal conscious torment, and you've given me everlasting joy in your presence. But all we have for dinner is ramen noodles and Cheerios. And so he found himself complaining. Grumbling and whining and thankfulness are not ultimately the heart's responses to circumstances, but to God. And I got to believe, I don't know about in England, but I believe this is 21st century America's biggest problem. Maybe not biggest, but one of the biggies. You know, it's not as prevalent even in Africa, I don't believe, or India, or many, many other parts of the world that have much more of an awareness of the sovereignty of God, that things are going to be the way they're going to be. But here, we have a different set of expectations on account of that. When they are not met, we find ourselves to be wonderful with the spirit of complaint. And we must make a move in our own soul. And I believe it will be a journey for us. And I believe there is reason that Paul is at the very end of his life before he could utter and get all of this worked out. The journey starts at this bottomless pit of give me a give me spirit, and hopefully ends at the entry of a spirit that says, Lord, you make me. Moves from give me into Lord, you make me. Let's circle back. Paul repeats the theme of joy over and over in this letter, and he tries to tie it, or he does tie it to various themes. He's tied it to prayer and joy. He's tied it to sharing God's good news or witnessing with joy. He's tied it to the unity of the church to joy. And here in this section, beginning with verse 12, it says the word therefore, and it is the therefore, this whole section is the outgrowth, is the outcome of following the humble modeling of Jesus Christ. Paul here gives his life freely in imitation of Christ. And he uses the word picture of an offering being poured out on the ground. This is the reason that both he and the Philippians and all who know God can rejoice. Because once we understand Christ, we can freely pour out our life. There is a cross on which Jesus humbly obeyed and died to conquer sin? Yes. And complaining. To root out the spirit of complaint. The cross sucks the juice out of your grumbling and replaces it with gratitude and thanksgiving and joy. Our job is to make this move from unbelief to belief, from mistrust to trust in God's promises. Friday night, we're at the ball game, and Steve and Susan wonderfully took us down to the game, and I remember if it was going down or coming back, we were just talking about family, and Becky was remembering her mother. And Becky was saying that recently, she was saying, I would like to become like my mom, who had the faith that Paul's describing and calling us to here. I don't mean by that Dorothy was perfect, nor that Becky wants to imitate everything about her. But what she did see, what we see in this passage, we saw Dorothy live out in her last days. She spent the last 5 weeks in the hospital in enormous pain. Last 5 weeks of her life. And in those last few weeks, people, of course, family and friends would come to see her. But they came to be an encouragement to Dorothy, of course, and to love her, and they did that. But here's what happened. Just this amazing reversal happened again and again and again, that those who came were encouraged by having come. She greeted people while in her hospital bed by name. She asked them in a personal way, attending to details and often with astonishing detail about situations and circumstances in their life. And one by one, as people visited, she affirmed them and blessed them. She gave blessings. She moved past complaint to pouring out her life for others. In the text, we see it in the life of Christ. We see it in the Apostle Paul. We, as children on this journey, are being called to it as well. It is possible through faith to sacrificially give ourselves with joy. God bless you.